Okay, so we're back now to look at John Arthur's critique of Peter Singer. Hopefully by now you've been able to see all the videos. It's especially important to me that you're able to hear Singer describe his philosophy in his own words. It's a great opportunity to actually hear a living philosopher talk about his own ideas. So you should have a pretty good idea of what he wants to argue and why now. And we're going to look at the next article by another contemporary philosopher, John Arthur, who's making a case against Singer's ethics on our obligations to the poor. So Arthur's argument against Singer is going to be based on certain premises. So keep in mind that the main crux of Arthur's argument is not putting forth his own ethical point of view, although he does have a philosophy, which is not what we're getting right here on this issue. It's mainly just trying to show that Singer is wrong and to deconstruct Singer's argument. So the first thing that Arthur wants to say is that acts of charity ought to remain in this category that we call supererogation or supererogatory acts. So you saw from the previous video that we talked about obligation versus supererogation. And so Arthur is saying that charity should remain in the category of moral extra credit, things you get bonus points for doing, but that you're not a bad person if you don't do. He wants to say that we don't have any special obligations to share our resources with the poor. And he does use this idea of we, writing from the perspective that, of course, the reader is going to be someone who does have these extra resources that they don't have to give up. And then he's going to base his whole theory on a social contract approach. So think back to Hobbes and Hobbes' idea of the social contract, which is based on people coming together and agreeing on how they're going to conduct themselves together and what rules they're going to follow. So Arthur's case against Singer has some specific objections to Singer's approach. The first is that he thinks that if we were to follow Singer's argument to its logical conclusion, that it would have absurd implications. This is mainly based on the fact that Singer is a utilitarian philosopher, and Arthur thinks that following utilitarianism generally would lead us to do things that he finds absurd. So we'll talk about that in some more detail. He also thinks that Singer has overlooked some moral principles that Arthur finds to be very important. And those principles are what we have the right to keep for ourselves versus what others can claim to deserve from us. So again, we'll talk about that in more detail. And then he also says that Singer's argument is impractical, that nobody will do it, and it's not a practical proposition to make to tell people to behave this way. So Arthur is addressing the strong version of Singer's argument, the one that says if you should give until you're sacrificing something of comparable moral significance to the life or death of another person. So on page 259, Arthur calls this Singer's greater moral evil rule. So as you're thinking about Arthur's case, one thing to think about is whether his case is also an effective argument against Singer's contemporary version, the weaker version, or whether this is only really an argument against that strong version that Singer has since backed off from. So let's look a little bit at the main objections that Arthur has to Singer's ideas. He talks about the absurd implications of Singer's view, and he gives us some examples to get us to think about that. So what Arthur is getting at here is not just a problem with Singer's theory, but with the utilitarian approach to life in general. And the reason for that, he says, is that if we really think about the way utilitarianism operates, it's a theory that requires us to constantly be trying to create good for others. We saw this as a critique of utilitarianism the first time around last week when we were talking about the theory in general. So what Arthur wants us to think about is there are many, many instances where we would have to sacrifice things that are very strongly in our own self-interest in order to make other people happy, because we're always required to do what will maximize happiness at the expense of other people. So the example that he gives, and the reason why I have this image here, is that he gives the example of somebody needing a kidney. Even if I don't want to give up my kidney, I like having 2 kidneys. Under utilitarianism, Arthur says, I might be required to give up my kidney for the greatest good for someone else, even though I would like to keep it. I don't particularly need it because I have 2 kidneys. So he gives us these examples. Let's see here on page 260. He gives us a few other examples as well, imagining people who are demanding sexual favors, who we might, under utilitarianism, be morally obliged to give. Singer would probably respond to a lot of this. There are probably a lot of harms that would come from forcing people to give up their kidneys, for example. that Arthur's not anticipating. But Arthur's broader point is to raise issues with any theory that says that one person is responsible for maximizing the happiness of lots of other people, under the idea that people have a right to keep things that are theirs, like their kidneys or their money. So these examples are on 260, and I encourage you to look at those. They're in the second paragraph under the heading Rights and Desert. So one issue that Arthur really wants us to think about is the idea of entitlements. So if you've spent any time in the United States or keeping up with U.S. politics, which some of our students have and some may not have, entitlements is a term that gets thrown around a lot in politics. What politicians usually mean by that is programs like welfare or others that are meant to aid the poor, and they're just depicted as entitlement programs as a way to make them seem less good and less popular. So when we hear this word, there's some baggage to it to Americans that we probably need to kind of unpack. So Arthur wants us to think about this idea of entitlements by contrasting the idea of rights and duties. So we think about rights. We talked about those a little bit with Hobbes, right? And we said that rights are anything that we all agree on together, and they basically determine what we can expect from each other. I can expect other people not to try to kill me if I want to claim a right not to be killed by them, for example. And these usually have to do with people's actions, right? Things that we want them to not do, actions that we don't want them to take. Or if we're talking about me claiming a right to be given something, someone will have to take an action to give me that thing. Things that we deserve, these are things that we can claim for ourselves. So if I want to say that I deserve a certain minimum level of income, right? If we're talking about a debate in the United States on the minimum wage, let's say, we might say that people deserve a certain basic minimum and they can claim that for themselves from their employer. So this usually has to do with things, money, property, or something else. Maybe it is shelter, for example. So this is just to clear up some of the language. To get a little deeper into the idea of moral rights, Arthur is going to distinguish between two types of rights. The first is negative, and those are the main types of rights that we are talking about when we talk about forming a social contract, things that we don't want people to do to us. So we call these rights of non-interference. And the reason they're called negative rights is not because they're bad, but because they tell people not to do things. They're prohibitions. So don't kill me, don't steal from me, don't beat me up, right? These are all things that we want people not to do, and that's why we call them negative rights or rights of non-interference. Don't get involved with my stuff. So these require other people to refrain from doing certain things. These are usually depicted by people who put forth a natural rights idea as rights that we have just by virtue of being human. So if we wanted to talk about, go back to Martin Luther King, right? The people that just by virtue of being a person have certain rights. These are usually negative rights, the rights not to be messed with in some way or harmed in some way. So these are the main ones that are covered in the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights. There are also positive rights, and these are what we call rights of recipients. Rights of recipients mean that these are things that I have a right to receive or be given by other people or by the government, by somebody else, things that I have the right to receive. So it would require other people to do something for me. A really good example of this is public education in the United States. So a while ago, our country decided that all children have the right to receive a certain basic free minimum level of education. And now somebody has to provide that. So that's why we have public schools, to provide that positive right to an education. Positive rights are things that have to be negotiated. We have to make a promise to deliver them, and we have to agree that they're important. So there are some things that we don't agree on as a positive right. For example, healthcare in the United States. We don't agree in this country whether that is a basic right that everyone has, should have access to some minimum standard of healthcare, or whether we think that is something that's a privilege that you get to buy if you happen to have enough money. So positive rights are things we negotiate. They're a little bit more controversial than negative rights. So yeah, there's my picture for education. So the basic idea here that Arthur is getting at by getting into this rights language is to get us to think about whether the poor can claim a right of recipients, a right to receive something from people who have more than they do. So we're all going to agree that everyone has to respect other people's negative rights not to be harmed, not to be killed, stolen from, beaten up, or otherwise physically harmed in some way. Because they're basic human rights, and a lot of people would say they don't even require an explicit agreement in the form of a social contract. But positive rights, again, we have to negotiate and agree upon. So they're not universal. We can't just run around saying, I have the right to take this from you. We have to negotiate that and agree on it together. So they require an explicit agreement. So this is going to lead us to Arthur's big question, which is whether the poor have a moral right to receive other people's resources. So what you're probably noticing here is that Arthur has turned the tables. Singer was trying to address what the obligations of people who have more are towards people who have less. That was Singer's big question. Arthur's question is, what can the poor claim from the wealthy or from people who are not in absolute poverty? So it's a slightly different question that's going to show us who Arthur and Singer are really concerned about. So if the poor did have this right, it would be a positive right of recipients. They would be saying that they have the right to receive something from other people. And it would therefore only apply if I had said, I will give this to you, or if we as a society said, you deserve this. Arthur concludes that the poor do not have this right to other people's resources. Now, he's not saying that the world's poor are running around so greedily trying to take people's money. All he's really trying to show is that they don't have a moral right to other people's resources, and if they don't have that right, then there's nothing unethical about keeping those resources to yourself if you happen to have them. So it'd be nice to help them, but it's not required. And in that case, we know that we're still going to be in the realm of charity being an act of supererogation. So in order to illustrate his point, on page 261, Arthur tells this story about the farmer and his neighbor. And it's very similar to a parable that we tell to our children a lot called The Story of the Ant and the Grasshopper that you may be familiar with. The story is, example is really short at the bottom of 261. He says, suppose, for example, an industrious farmer manages through hard work to produce a surplus of food for the winter while a lazy neighbor spends his summer fishing. So already we have certain characterizations of the person who has a lot of resources, the industrious farmer who works hard to get what he has, and the neighbor who's going to need help, who is being described as lazy. So there are a lot of presuppositions here about how and why people who have more do have more, and how and why people who have less that we might want to examine that, right? It is certainly true that sometimes people who are wealthy have gotten there through hard work. It's not always true. And sometimes true that people who are poor are also lazy, but that's certainly not always true, right? There are people who are living in absolute poverty who simply don't have the means to get out of it on their own. So we probably want to examine some of the underlying assumptions that are present in this example that Arthur's giving us. But his conclusion here is that anything you earn through your hard work, in this case of the example that he has of the farmer, his surplus food, you have the right to keep, and nobody can claim to deserve that from you. So the farmer might decide to help his poor neighbor who runs out of food in the winter, and that would be very nice of him to do. It would in fact be an act of supererogation. He would get moral extra credit for doing it. But that farmer wouldn't be a bad person if he decided not to help his neighbor, because the farmer deserves to keep everything he got through his own labor. So Arthur has a proposal, a way to think about this issue that's very different from Singer's. And he says basically that because Singer's proposal is so impractical, that's the main problem with it. And we need a moral code that people are actually going to be able to follow. So you're going to see some evidence here in Arthur of the egoist idea of human nature, because since no one will do what Singer suggests, that means that people are actually way more selfish than Singer's philosophy gives them credit for. So our moral code has to be realistic about our inherent selfishness. We want to keep our stuff, and that's okay according to Arthur. We should be allowed to keep our stuff because we're entitled to anything we get through hard work, through the fruits of our own labor. And we might be selfish about that, but that's fine. And we need to take that into account when we put forth a moral theory. We also tend to be subjective, he says, and so it's not realistic to expect us to give to people that we don't know or care about. Thirdly, he says, we're not always aware of the consequences of giving. Our efforts to help often don't work. Now, Singer would rebut this. Singer says that's not an excuse. You just have to do your research. And so if you watched the video of him being interviewed by Colbert, you probably saw that. So Arthur's conclusion then is that people should help the poor. That would be nice of them to do, only when there's no substantial cost to themselves. So basically, when it doesn't hurt me in any way, I am at no disadvantage from helping the poor, then I should do it. But if it's going to be even a minor inconvenience for me, it's okay for me to keep everything I have to myself. So we have a very, very, very low obligation to the poor under Arthur's proposal, based on the idea that we have the right to keep everything we earn or work hard to get, and that no one else has a right to claim that from us just because they need it more than we do. Okay, so I just want to recap by doing a little compare and contrast between Singer and Arthur so that you guys can think about where you stand on this. You might choose one or the other. You might have a third option that you think is better than both of them. So Singer's got a utilitarian approach. He is advocating this idea that we call negative responsibility. That, again, is the idea that you're responsible for your decision not to act. So if I know someone is in need and I decide not to do anything about it, according to the utilitarian approach, I'm held responsible for not taking action. And Singer really was relying on this idea that under utilitarianism, there's a moral imperative to relieve suffering when we encounter it or when we know about it. All suffering is equal, remember, and that's why we have to help the people who are suffering the most, not the people who happen to be near us or who we happen to care about. And he's going to recategorize charity as an act of obligation, not a supererogatory act. Arthur's a little different. He's going to be basing his idea on the idea of the social contract. That's why we're talking about legal language like rights and duties and the idea of what people deserve. He's focusing on entitlement, and he's going to say that no one is entitled to another person's resources. For that reason, charity remains an act of supererogation for Arthur. It is not something that we're obligated to do. All right, that's the end of this text and this discussion of obligation versus supererogation as it relates to the issue of poverty.